Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this webinar on the human rights of older people, or maybe better said, the human rights in older age. We are happy that many of you are joining this webinar in order to discuss today the new areas that will be discussed at the United Nations regarding the enjoyment of human rights of older people. As you know, this is a process towards contributing to the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Aging is a process that takes many of our energies every year, and this year, 2019, is not an exception. We are now very busy preparing the contributions, and you are also, many of you, very busy contributing to AGE's consultation on this matter. And this webinar is part of those efforts. We did it also last year. We like the format, and I think members appreciated it a lot as well. And we are repeating. That's the reason why we are repeating it now. So as I was saying, today we are covering the new matters, the new topics, the new focus areas to be discussed in April at the 10th session of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, which are social protection, social security, and education, lifelong learning, capacity building. I will start, so I will explain you the structure of the webinar. I will start by presenting a bit globally what the Open-Ended Working Group is about, what we are trying to achieve with it, very, very briefly. And we will then focus on the two themes I was mentioning. And for that, we will have the participation of Philippe, who's, as you know, the person responsible for those areas in AGE's team. My colleague Julia, who's in charge of health issues, is also there because social protection also includes, to a great extent, healthcare matters. And she will be able to react as well and contribute to the discussions. But we will start first with these two presentations, and then we will open the floor to allow you to make any questions and any comments. And that's why actually we are doing the webinar. If you want to write any questions while we are talking, you can do that in the chat. If you look at the bottom of the GoToMeeting window, you will see that there is a chat window where you can write questions. So I encourage you to do so if you have anything to add or anything you wouldn't like to forget, and we will address those questions, respond to them at the end of the webinar. For the moment, I would ask you to mute yourselves. I'm trying to, so I was meeting a couple of participants just to make sure that we don't have any noises at this moment. But I will, of course, open the floor at the end of after the two presentations for your questions and comments. So let me start sharing my own screen. And presenting, as I was mentioning, presenting a bit overall what the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group is trying to achieve and what this is all about. So I was mentioning the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. I think by now many of you are familiar with this name that may not be actually extremely friendly or easy to remember, the OEWG on Aging. So what is it? This is a picture of this year's session, and well, not very well chosen picture, to be honest, because the room is quite empty in this one, but luckily this is not the situation usually. So the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging was created in 2010, and its mission is double. On the one hand, the UN Open-Ended Working Group is about strengthening the protection of the human rights of older people, and secondly, to consider the feasibility of new instruments and measures. A very important point here is that the group was set up by the UN General Assembly. And why? Because states decided that this was worth creating. So when we are building the case for the work of this group, and we are trying to persuade states to get involved, it's important to remind them that this is a group that was created by the commitment, because of the commitment of states. Let me continue. Yeah, so these are some pictures of this year's session. Sorry, this year's, no, 2018's 18th session. On the top, you have a picture of the age delegation, so including people from the, well, Age Platform Europe as such, Ebe, our president, and myself, but also other representatives of age members who are accredited and who are themselves directly taking part to the process. On the bottom, you have other pictures of other activities, a side event we organized, and also a meeting between NGOs that we organized before the session to prepare the NGOs' participation. So who's involved in the group? The group is very open, as the name itself says. So it is open to states, of course, whom are the the natural members of this group, but also to national human rights institutions, the ombudsman. There is one of those in every of your countries, and also to civil society, to us, to NGOs. What's our key message in this group? So the key message that we are defending is pretty straightforward and may look pretty simple, but it is actually very important, and it is, an ongoing challenge for us to include and to mainstream this approach in all our policy positions. And this is something we have been developing a lot in the last years. It is the fact that the lack of enjoyment of any of the rights or any, access to any kinds of goods or services in society or to participation in society, the lack of enjoyment of this in older age, that is a violation of human rights. So it is about, in a way, challenging the usual approaches about older age as a period of life where we cannot pretend to enjoy equality and to live fully integrated and as equals in society. That's the common wisdom. It's about challenging this and about saying that these kind of approaches are actually equal to a violation of human rights. They are not something to take lightly, but they constitute a real violation of human rights. And this is something we are trying to highlight and mainstream in all positions around all themes that are being discussed at the United Nations, including also this year's, as we will see later on. There are some achievements already of this group. The fact that human rights are now, human rights in older age are now on the agenda of the UN very, very clearly, that the NGOs are having playing an important role in shaping a human rights understanding of older age, that discussions are now getting substantial, and that they are helping us advance a lot our work, thinking about these topics in a different way, adopting this human rights approach I was referring to. And of course, this group gives us access to the UN more widely, and that allows us to have good contacts with many UN officials in also other departments. Of course, there are also challenges, and the fact that the EU and EU countries are overall not very actively involved is one of them. Also, the lack of funding, even though this year there is some funding allocated to the UN Open-Ended Working Group, and that's why the session is taking place in a pretty good period of the year, which is April. And also that we need a more greater direct participation of older people, whom are at the moment pretty absent from the session, from the panels that are organized to discuss these topics. So the next session is in April, between the 15th and the 18th of April. We'll be going there, and I believe also other age accredited members. And the themes are those I was referring to, and that we are discussing today in this webinar. AH's contribution will be, first of all, submitting written inputs that we have to submit actually by the 1st of February. So timing is very challenging, and that's why we are speeding up now the preparations, and that's why you have heard from us a bit more in the last weeks. And we will also be delivering oral statements during the session itself, and we'll be producing written versions that we will also publish in the website, as we have been doing in the last years. So of course we need you for that, and this webinar is a key moment for us to prepare for the session, because we think that your contributions orally are also very, very important and very they really help us write our written submissions. So these are some ideas of the kinds of contributions that you can make, reflecting on your country's situation, providing us with examples of discrimination, of gaps in protection of the right of all people to access to education, social protection, etc. And you can also reflect on what obligations states should have to guarantee other people's rights to have access to such entitlements. And now I will give the floor to Philippe without any further delay, who will be elaborating more in detail into this year's topics. So Philippe, you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you, Borja, and hello to everybody. I'm just trying to share my screen, and it seems to work. Okay, so I'll quickly dive into the more thematic aspects, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. So as Borja said, the two main topics this year are social protection and social security, and education, training, lifelong learning, and capacity building. And well, there is a challenge when you hear that many things enter into that. So it seems to be a very broad thing. There's words like capacity building, which are not really defined. So we try to explain a bit what's meant by that. Sorry, where's the presentation here? Okay. So one thing that I just wanted to quickly touch on is the notion of economic and social rights, because for many, when you hear about human rights, you hear about, you think of like violence or the right to vote, or things that are more in the domain of civil and political rights. And economic, social, and social rights are not that well understood. So this is just a quick point to translate the different notions that are floating around and to make them maybe a bit more meaningful. So essentially, it's about what a state is supposed to do to guarantee a certain economic, social, or cultural right. That has been defined when there's a convention on economic, social, and cultural rights, and right after the ratification of this convention, the committee that is in charge of that has tried to define this. So what's most known are the buzzwords respect, protect, and fulfill. Respecting a right means respecting someone exercising the right. So as a state, do not prevent someone from exercising a right. So let's take the right to education, not to inhibit someone to go to school. Protecting means to protect persons who are exercising these rights from third-party interference. So, for example, protect someone going to school from people who are on this way to school and who would bully or threaten people. I'm taking this example now because it's a bit more telling. And to fulfill a right means to actually provide this. Now, there's this notion of progressive realization because, of course, not all member states of the UN in the world have the same capacities to provide such a right as the right to social protection. So the main idea of fulfilling is to not to take steps backwards from the systems you have, to have a plan or a national strategy towards better realization of this right, and to have this notion of progressive realization. So it's not because you have accepted a right to social protection that tomorrow you need to protect all your population from all risks that are there, but you need to have a plan and you need to take concrete steps towards realizing this right. And the two last notions I put there are a bit less known: remedies and accountability. It means when someone exercises the right and they have problems with it, can they complain? Can they actually say that their rights have been infringed? So it means it covers all sorts of mechanisms, from going to court to having a mediator or to having a contact person within this specific service that is relevant, that you can complain to. So remedies and accountability is this. And the last point is sort of the follow-up of having a national strategy. It's monitoring, having indicators and benchmarks to actually control where are we with this right. Is it being respected, or to which extent is it being respected, and where are we going? So these are the obligations that member states have regarding all economic and social and cultural rights. So let's go into the first topic on social protection and social security. As I said, it's quite large. We received the questions from several members. What is meant by that? So essentially, the UN Convention doesn't say a lot. It essentially says that they recognize the right to social security, including social insurance. There has been a general comment that tried to spell this out. You will receive the link and the text. I don't want you to read all the texts. They are there because you will receive this presentation afterwards, and then you can look at them. But the general comment essentially tried to define which areas of social protection this applies to. So lack of work-related income, etc. We'll come back to that later. And then there's the notion of social protection floors. Now, this goes to a different instrument, which has been adopted relatively recently by the International Labour Organization, that also tries to introduce sort of minimum standards for social protection. So I go very quickly on that to go right into the actual questions. So to summarize what I've just shown in text, what does social protection mean in this context of rights? It means minimum incomes, both in the sense of minimum pensions of people who have not been able to contribute to the pension systems and who have no income, as also minimum incomes such as social assistance when people are unable to work before pension age. So it's these two, in many member states, it's two different systems. So both systems are considered minimum incomes. Then state pensions, of course, that's the first thing you would think of, but also things like occupational pensions or survivors' pensions for widows and widowers. They are also part of the system. So a member state can say, we don't. Let's think of systems like the Netherlands or the UK. A member state can say we provide relatively low state pensions, because the main thing for us is not state pensions. We try to put this obligation to employers to constitute occupational pensions that are not managed by the state, but by the employer, by social partners or whatever. This is an acceptable realization of the right. But still, the member state has a responsibility to look after that and to ensure that no one is left behind. So occupational pensions are as well part of that. Healthcare, I think in this context, we shouldn't dive too much into healthcare, because probably there will be a specific discussion on healthcare for older persons, because it's such a huge topic later on in the process of the open-ended working group. But still, what should be covered here is the very basic healthcare. So emergency healthcare, or the fact of having access or not to healthcare. Sickness benefits, it's not the same as healthcare. Sickness benefits is pay when you are working and you're unable to continue working because of a sickness. You could also put disability benefits in there. Unemployment benefits are part of social protection, and long-term care, I put them together with disability benefits. And family benefits, they're, of course, when you look at usually what's understood by family benefits, it's family allowances to people who have children. If there are things like carers benefits that benefit to older people, that is also a family benefit if it's managed by the state. So this is also part of the social protection area. For the purposes of our submission, I think we will mainly focus on minimum income and pensions, and things like accessibility and availability of the other ones. as I said, because long-term care, you all know there's a separate discussion on long-term care, so we should not cover this here. Unemployment or sickness benefits are part of the larger domain of the right to employment, so maybe they will also be covered somewhere else. So the main area should really be on pensions and minimum incomes and basic access to healthcare and disability services. For all these different schemes, there's more or less this is the questionnaire that you all received. There's certain aspects that need to be looked at. Just as I was explaining the different obligations of states, this is the translation of that into the area of social protection. So availability, adequacy, it essentially means, is the benefit provided sufficient to protect from poverty, or sufficient to lead a dignified life, which is not necessarily the same. Then there's questions on the coverage and on gaps. So it means, does everyone have access? Is no one excluded, for example, because of the age, or because of employment status, or because of the fact that someone is a disabled person? So does everyone has access? And additionally, if there are vulnerable groups, as I just mentioned, for example, persons with disabilities, is it ensured that they also have access? So just as an example, if you have a completely digital management of your pension system, and you have a person with a disability who is unable, not only who doesn't have the right skills and equipment, but who's unable to use a computer to claim this, and the website is not accessible, then this criteria of ensuring that vulnerable groups have access is not met. An important aspect is information. So is it clear for everybody how to access benefits, where to ask for them, where to ask whether you are entitled to benefits? And in the field of pensions, I would also include, is it clear for everyone which kind of pension you should be receiving also beforehand? So that's more on transparency and information. There's a question on participation. We translated that into, do beneficiaries have a say in the system? Do older people's organizations have a say in pension reforms? Are they consulted? In some member states, there's a structural management, for example, by social partners of the pension system. So these kinds of things are part of the participation domain. And redress, as I said before, if there's problems, is there a way to complain? Is there a way that you can address your grievances? So, sorry, I'm going out of here because I'm opening that window again. I think we can very quickly maybe discuss on this before we look into the aspect of employment, of education. Do you have questions on this or remarks on this? Don't hesitate, you can...
Thank you, Philip. Yes, I think if people have a comment, indeed they can either you write it on the chat, or you can also unmute yourselves and ask the question. So now we could spend between 5 and 10 minutes discussing these questions, right? And then we will move to the next topic. So any comments you may have on this first topic could be very much welcome.
Yeah, it's Ebbe here.
Ebbe, yeah.
Yes. And we have been discussing the social protection, and we have raised 2 questions for our ministry. The one point is what you also touched upon, the accessibility. Because of course older people not always have the possibility to use the website, and therefore we feel a lack of possibilities for people who are somehow hindered in getting access to the necessary information. And that also, of course, goes for the possible complaints if necessary. So accessibility is one point we would like to stress and question for our ministry. How can that be ensured and be improved? And what is the basis, which are the minimum requirements in a convention, for example? The second one is this about care and relatives, and there are several problems where, of course, governments want the relatives to take care of their family members as much as possible, but actually they do not have the proper education, and they do not have the possibilities to take a day off in their working life. So all in all, I think it's very important that we stress this about work-life barriers or work-life balance, which is a program EU are discussing, and the need to be support for the relatives because they are very much willing to take on the care work, but I think it should be stressed that they should be supported into a large degree. So those 2 points are the one we particularly want to raise for our ministry to also look at, beside the questionnaires which are on the paper already. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, Ebbe. Maybe one point that I'm just thinking of, what is important to stress in our contributions is how age is a criteria of different application of these rights. So, for example, when you say there's a problem with supporting informal carers, there's maybe no age criteria in there, but informal carers predominantly are older people. So if you say, well, there's a very sophisticated system in place for children and for young parents, but not for carers of adults, then there's an aspect where the needs of older people are not adequately covered.
Yeah, I think Elisabeth, you wanted to wanted to make a comment, right?
Yes, I do. I want to pick up on this and what you're saying, and particularly from Ebbe. I think what we must stress here is the gender perspective, because if you're looking at social protection, you're looking at the opportunities for men and women to contribute to their either state pension or occupational pensions. And of course, we know there is the gender pay gap. So therefore, if women have been in work, they are likely to have smaller pension because they are less well paid. Their contributions are going to be smaller, and therefore their income in retirement will be considerably smaller. Many are only reliant on state pensions because of inabilities to contribute to occupational pensions. The issue of carers, is I think we need to not think about, I mean, I know that older people are doing a lot of caring, but also that sandwich generation, women and men 55 plus being able to who are caring both for children and for older elders, and therefore again impacts on their ability to work and therefore contribute to their pensions. And I think we just need, I mean, certainly we need to be, I think there's quite a bit of research that we could pull together to put in the age statement on that area. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. We will definitely have something on the gender differences here.
Yeah, I take so from Eve's comments, I think it's really important, the issue about access, because it's also one of the areas where we need to reflect and where the UN is asking us to provide input. So the fact that sometimes the mechanisms, the systems that are put in place to claim for your rights to social protection may not be accessible to everyone. So this is something, an area where we need, to make sure that this is not the case, that there are not such barriers. So this is one barrier, and also the gender dimension that Elizabeth was mentioning. So the access to social protection of specific vulnerable groups of older people are also addressed in the UN consultation, in the questionnaire. So that's something we should certainly highlight.
I actually have a bit of difficulty with the term vulnerable. I don't think older women are vulnerable.
Yeah.
I just think, I suppose we're vulnerable to the systems that are already there, but in ourselves, we're not vulnerable. Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Careful how you word it.
I think when with the word vulnerable, it's not necessarily women which are meant, women per se. I would say the pure gender aspect is rather covered by does everyone has access on equal terms. When they specify the term vulnerable, it's more about more specific situations. So what about women who have never worked? What about women with disabilities? What about very old women? What about women who are have been who have experienced a divorce in later life or something, or survivors? That's more what's meant with vulnerable.
And I think and in more general, I think we also, I don't know if the issue of refugees and migrants will come into another open-ended working group as a theme, but I think we should in a sense mainstream them as well. But
yeah, well, I think when we address, let's say,
can I have a word?
Well, okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Moses.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. First thing, what you said then, but the social security system is based on two bases: on the basis of contribution and on the basis of non-contributory pensions. So everybody will become adequate. I'm not adequate. Will become covered by the system. The first question that I'm going to answer is it sufficient? Here in Malta, no, it is not sufficient. The European Commission has said in the report on Malta that the pensions in Malta are not adequate. And this happened because the maximum pensionable income is very low. It is so low that at this moment, if a person has the maximum pensionable income and is a couple, he is now at risk of poverty level. At this time, I said everything that I had to say on this. Then I will say other things about other things that crop up. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. What's happening? Thank you, Moses, and that is also what you were highlighting in your written contribution. So thank you for that. We did receive that.
Indeed, we have to also a point in the contribution to the UN. They are asking us to report on. So what's the situation currently? Are the levels of social protection in older age sufficient? Do they guarantee a good standard of living? And so these are questions to which we can certainly respond thanks to your contributions, and also all the European Commission data and Eurostat data. And I mean, we have enough, let's say, hard data to show the problems regarding the levels of social protection in older age, and lots of work has been done by EH in the last years as well on that front. So that's something we certainly need to highlight. Okay, so maybe Philippe, it's already 11:36. I mean, we have
Yeah.
discussed very superficially social protection, but we need to also cover the other topics. So maybe you can go for that. And if anyone wants to make another comment about social protection later, we can always go back to social protection at some point later.
I'll just maybe read very quickly for everyone the comment made by Francesca in the chat, in case you don't see it. Hello, everybody. We could say that these aspects coverage reflects the general principles stated in the WeDo projects on long-term care. And these are basically a way to measure the quality of the enjoyment of rights. So that's true because the WeDo framework has been taking a human rights approach. So this is why you see this parallelism.
In a way, if I may add, Philippe, I think Francesca, so when it comes to social protection, we should be thinking of also regarding the costs related to long-term care and whether states are able to provide enough support to individuals to cover for their the costs associated with the care needs they have. And we have now evidence from the European Commission also showing how social protection is inadequate or insufficient for long-term care needs in many European Union countries, if not actually most of them. The WeDo framework, I think, is more relevant for the discussions we had on the right to long-term care as such. So regarding, the kinds of principles that should guide the delivery of long-term care, putting the person at the center, respecting their dignity in all aspects of life, guaranteeing their autonomy and their independence, etc. So I think WeDo fits better in the discussions on long-term care specifically, that actually we will be also having on the webinar we are doing on Tuesday, specifically on the normative elements around long-term care. So when it comes to social protection, we should be, in my view, thinking more in that dimension of, whether states are currently covering the costs associated with long-term care. But I hope you are all there on Tuesday, and we can discuss more in detail how WeDo also fits into shaping a right to long-term care as such.
Okay, so thank you, Borja. I'll go on with education. Yeah, this very quickly. You can read it later on. Those are the aspects that have so far been highlighted by members in their written contributions. But we've been discussing on many of these things already. So education, training, lifelong learning, and capacity building. As I said, it's a very long title, meaning many different things. And actually, this is an area which is not very well defined in international law when you look at older persons. So there's a right to education in the UN Convention on Economic Rights that says that it should aim the full development of human personality, that everyone should participate. Yeah, but then when you look in the general comments on education, it more or less covers mainly primary, secondary, and tertiary education, but not lifelong learning. The only other text we have is a general comment on the economic, social, and cultural rights of older persons. That is a major source of all our work on human rights, because it's more or less the only place, authoritative place, where older persons are specifically mentioned in the human rights framework. And
Philippe, sorry, may I interrupt you? We cannot see your slide on education. We only see the right to social protection. So I don't know if you can try
yes.
the issue.
Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, now it's working.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So you have the article on the UN Convention on economic, social, and cultural rights above, and the lower part is the general comment of the committee. So they have a paragraph on education. Interestingly, they interpret the right to education to the right of older persons to benefit from educational programs, but also to make the know-how and experience of older persons available to younger generations. So it's a very interesting aspect, because they also cover older persons as transmitters of education and as providers of education. So that's very interesting. I won't dive into the next paragraph, which is more specific. You can do that at home. But so essentially, which kinds of forms are covered by education? Of course, looking at older persons only. Of course, university education is relevant because it's possible, or it should be possible, for people of any age to start with university education and to engage with that. The more obvious form is lifelong learning, but that's a very large field. It covers, of course, formal education, such as courses. Well, it wouldn't actually be formal, but informal education, such as courses that are provided, for example, by a popular university kind of institutions on local level, courses on activities, but also recreational things. That's important. But what's also considered learning is non-formal learning. It means the experiences that people acquire just by doing certain things. Not necessarily in course, and that they don't get a diploma for that, but just by that. So this is also part of education. Of course, that is not organized by the state. Informal education is organized by the state in a certain way. What I would also put in there is essentially financing by states, by regions, by local authorities to civil society organizations or non-profit organizations to provide education, to provide activities. Because it is a sector which is not very well organized, and rightly so, because people don't necessarily want to engage in courses, but where activities, and especially recreational activities, are important. So again, in these forms of education, which aspects are covered? Of course, can everybody access these? Are there some groups excluded? Are you excluded, for example, because you are of pension age? So there's some trainings that are only available to persons of working age or considered working age, when it's more in the domain of professional training. Groups that could be excluded could be people living in institutions, for example. We have also always the positive example of the Erasmus project or the Women's Network on activating 80+, that was trying to address this kind of exclusion of persons who are not living in the community, but living in a sort of an institution, a retirement home, or who are beneficiaries of long-term care, and how to activate these. So that's a positive example, but to a large part, these groups are excluded. And are there specific measures to try to include these vulnerable groups? And yeah, because you were talking about migration, of course, people with a migration background or older migrants are in many cases considered to be a vulnerable group. I mean, depending on their circumstances, of course, but some of them don't have access to many things. There is an aim for self-reliance and community responsibility in the right to education. So education should aim self-reliance. And that's especially important in now that, for example, digital skills become more and more important. So is there sort of a digital skills education provided to older persons to continue to be self-reliant? So the overall questions for this: are the contents that are provided by education meaningful? Are they geared towards social inclusion? And is it of good quality? Because education can also mean activities that activate people, that have people participating, but that don't necessarily teach them many things, and that are rather boring and rather just ways to have people occupied, but without a goal towards self-reliance. So quality is quite important. Then the committee focused a question on monitoring. Also, because this sector is not organized, So are there studies about the participation of older people in learning activities? Is there any monitoring, any follow-up? There is a European indicator, for example, on participation in lifelong learning, but it wouldn't cover many of the activities that we would consider educational, recreational activities for older people. And redress, so if things are not delivered or are wrong, are there measures for older people to complain? So that's against this human rights framework. Yeah, so I don't know if you have comments on these, whether you have covered these aspects, whether you have questions about the scope of this right.
I would say it is one of the questions that I think it's really important, is the one that you mentioned at the beginning, Philippe. So the question about the access to such educational programs. So are there obstacles? Are older people excluded from access to such educational lifelong learning programs? That's something we would like to also hear from you. I think, Moses, you have something to ask or say? Sorry. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, yes.
Moses, can I speak?
Yeah, you can.
Yes, please.
One thing that I want to mention is you mentioned good practices. I think in Malta we have an example of good practice, and I think there are other countries. That is the University of the Third Age. So there you can learn a vast number of subjects. Someone are just academical, but other are how to learn some skills. And nobody is excluded. And I think that this measure, I think, is also, in Ireland, but I think there are other countries who use it. It is interesting to know how many of these participants in their countries have this university. Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this comment. The questionnaires of the UN are directed mainly towards member states, because, as Borja said in the beginning, the main actors in the open-ended working group are states. So governments will try to put everything they do positive into that. Now, we should, of course, highlight things that we consider positive and good practices, but I think our role should rather be to be critical of that and to look at, well, okay, we have this program, let's say a third age university, but to look at, is it adequately financed? As we said, does everybody have access? Is there a special effort to include, for example, persons living in poverty, or to increase the knowledge of the existence of these schemes and things like that? So there's just a sort of an overall comment. I don't want you to be also too negative and just say everything is bad. That's also not our role, but really to be critical of constructively critical of what your government might say.
It's Ebbe. Can I make a comment now?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yes, we also discussed this item, and of course there are a lot of possibilities for education, and as NGOs we also offer a lot of options. But if we look to the formal education, which are very interesting for people who are willing to maintain their mental capacity, for example, they get interested in history or in languages and so on, they could in old days participate in the education which were available to also the younger people. That has now been limited with a special higher or more than double price for participating for an older person. And it says directly that for pensioners, and the price will be higher, and it is very much higher if they want to participate. And that has caused the institutions to close down many of the offers. So I think the questionnaire here with the 6 questions lack a question about affordability. It can either be that the government has to support in such a way that the price are equal to everybody, but now it is a discrimination, and the older people do not have the money for such an expensive participation. So therefore, somehow affordability or non-discrimination access to education should be stressed much stronger than in this questionnaire. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. That's interesting, an interesting example. And so, can you maybe say a bit more? So, what kind of formal education institution you are referring to? Is it like a mainstream? Like what kind of institution is it that has increased the prices for older people?
Yeah, we have, should I say, a formal education which are called adult education. VUC, which are accessible to everybody in their working lives and also as young. But we also have ones which are called HD, which are particularly for the younger people. So it's more or less cover all ages. And the advantage is that you have qualified teachers. And in old days, when the price was equal, older people wanted to attend to that, and also the young people liked this mixture of age because somebody comes in with more knowledge or more background. So anyway, it's a pity for the young people that they had to close down the courses to a large extent, and for the older people that they cannot educate themselves or maintain their capacity. That means their talents or fulfill their wishes. So I feel that it's a lack, and the idea, of course, is that if you are in the working age, we can offer education for you. But as pensioners, you have to pay full price, and that means that we don't really want to spend money on you. So that's the background to it.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, a great illustration of, well, it's a discriminatory practice, clearly, right? And then, well, access to education is one of the questions we got from the UN, and this kind of lack of access we should highlight that in our contribution. So, you know, the exercise we are doing at the end is about saying, well, okay, so now pensioners have to pay the full price. And this limits access. So some may think, well, that's normal because, well, you have the pension and then you just, you know, cannot pretend to have same access as someone else, or, you know, there will be a tendency because ageism is so widespread. There could be maybe a temptation to justify such a practice. So we are doing this exercise to say, well, that's not justifiable. You cannot, I don't know the detail, of course, of what's going on in Denmark, but I assume this represents such an obstacle to the participation in such program that, well, I mean, we should say this equals to a breach of human rights, of your capacity to live as an equal and to be involved in society, really. So this is a good example of the kind of gaps or obstacles or breaches of equal participation that we are trying to highlight. So thanks for bringing that up. Elisabeth, yeah?
Yeah, I just say exactly the same in the UK, though I don't think it was doubled for older people. But the difficulty is that adult education is not statutory, and therefore it is the responsibility of local authorities or other charitable organizations which still exist. But it's about the fees that they have to charge to participate are very large. But it is an assumption that older people can do it for themselves. And while University of the Third Age is a very valuable experience. It is not necessarily qualified teachers, which was the point Ebba was making, that adult education, you got qualified teachers. And also too, in my experience as working with the local authority, the development of older people's capacity building often started in adult education classes, and those are no longer available. So the capacity and the opportunity for older people to come together, maybe not with the idea of forming a group to engage with the local authority on issues of policy, etc., but by the end of courses, often we're able to be more confident, to be more willing to, in a sense, take on the institutions, and to be able to be more confident to challenge the local authority about services, to challenge the doctors, to challenge the health service. So I think adult education is a route into other aspects, and that would be important to say. But in the UK, because it's not statutory and because the huge cuts to local government, it's just disappeared.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. One thing that also is often covered by the right to education is another, I didn't put it there in the quote, but there's a right to human rights education. So in the whole human rights discourse, human rights framework, there's usually a strong emphasis on, do member states provide knowledge about human rights to their citizens in order to give them the tools to complain, in order to tell them, well, what are your rights, and in how far can they be infringed, and so that people identify rights abuses. So that's very important. And also, of course, things like education for peace, and in education towards the values of the United Nations. That is also something that's often highlighted as important contents of the rights to education. Of course, it's the UN system trying to support itself, but that is also something to be highlighted. Yeah.
And maybe, Philippe, I'm curious to ask participants if they are aware of any. So there is a strong link that is today associated with the capacity to remain in employment and the access to lifelong learning. And this is said to be especially relevant and important for older workers. So those over, I would say, 50 years old. And that often we've heard, and well, Philippe, I'm sure you're more aware of this, but also the members in the webinar. So we are aware of cases where access to such lifelong learning programs has been limited, or that access is not available for older workers. So is there any such example you could maybe highlight, any of you? It's a very direct question, so I'm not, if you don't have anything to say, no worry, but this is a kind of example that will be really important to bring.
It does not necessarily need to be courses and trainings provided by the state. A lot of employers offer in-work training and stop providing this to older persons because they think they will stay less long in the company, so that it is not worth the investment. But that is something that should be highlighted as well.
Can I give my contribution, please?
Yes, please.
I want to change the subject because it's almost late now, about discrimination. We mention a lot about discrimination in travel insurance, and I think it has been even mentioned at the United Nations. I feel it is very unfair that when you are 75, you pay the double of the normal due. And then when you are 80, you continue to pay double that what you paid at 75. I think this is wrong. And I think another thing is that I say about Malta. Progressive taxation is normally not very used in taxation, but then it is used for pensioners. Why? Because if you go to an institution, you pay 60% of your income. So you are contributing to those who are not paying. I feel that is a kind of progressive taxation. And there is another objection from myself in Malta, that if you go to a government institution, you are not paid 300 extra, whilst you are in a private institution and you pay and you have 300 extra from taxation which is not taxable. I feel that is very unfair, because whether you are in a government institution or whether you are in a private institution, you are still paying for your upkeep. Okay, it might be not enough, but from the experience I have from people I know, at times you pay more at the government institution than you pay in a private institution. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks for this contribution, Moses. On taxation, I think you can highlight it in the part in your contribution to the questions on social protection, because the adequacy of social protection is also linked to that. If you say people cannot afford long-term care because the taxation is too high, then that is a that is something you can highlight. On travel insurance, this is maybe not the place to discuss it, but we will discuss it. We are working on that, so maybe we can follow that up later.
Yeah, also, we had the discussion already 2 years ago in 2017. The Open-Ended Working Group discussed equality and non-discrimination, and we discussed last year this topic as well from the normative point of view. So if we have one day a convention or any new international legal instrument on the rights of all people, how would a right to be live free from discrimination and as equals in society, how would that look like? And we discussed the insurance issue. So clearly age barriers are often, or age limits are often used in an abusive way. And this is something that states should be obliged to tackle much more actively. So this is something indeed, Moses, that we really have to work on, keep working on a lot, but we have already done some work. I was discussing with Philip. We are unfortunately arriving at the end of the webinar, so we think that maybe we have to close it here, because you will have also other obligations, I assume. But let me, before we close it, I would like to. I'm very curious to know a bit more, and that I would really like them to share their experience, because Ebe and Marina told us before the webinar started that they are doing efforts to contact their ministries in Denmark and in Croatia. Ebe, you seem to be successful and to have had already a meeting with the ministry to push them to prepare to be involved in the actively, Denmark to be involved and actively at the Open-Ended Working Group. Marina, you seem to struggle, even though you are doing also many efforts in Croatia. So maybe Ebe, could you very briefly share your experience, how you have managed to talk to the Danish ministry, and what kind of response you are getting from them?
Yes, hello. Now what we have done is that the NGOs who works on this items here, we have met and formulated, should I say, our supplementary remarks to the questionnaires. And then we have approached the ministry, and as last year we have got acceptance for a meeting. We have not had the meeting yet, so I cannot say anything else than they have accepted, and I will join the meeting together with the other NGOs, and there I hope they will produce a document like they did last year, and we would like to convey this through the foreign ministry because the representation at the open-ended working group is not the this ministry, it is the foreign ministry which are represented there. And therefore we need to convey it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eve. If you need any support for your meeting, or if you want us to provide you with some ideas or some bullet points or anything that can support you in the meeting, maybe to persuade the ministry and also the foreign affairs ministry to get involved in New York, please let us know, because we will be very happy to help from the secretariat in that. Marina, would you like to share also your experience in Croatia? Because you told us that you were really willing to push the government to get involved, and that you were asking for a meeting, but that this was not necessarily being successful. So could you share your experience with us? I think you have to unmute yourself by clicking in the microphone that should be showing green. Oh, yes, there you go.
Well, hi, I will be very short now because I have a next meeting that started 7 minutes ago. I just, the people from ministry are just giving us delays about meetings, and the problem here in Croatia is that there is not one strategy on older people. And not one is yet adopted by the ministry. Everything is still in some working sheets of papers, so that's a kind of difficult here. But while listening this, the main problem here is something that we wanted to talk to the ministry, is that the tax system enables retired people to participate in a way that alongside with their regular pension, they can occasionally work and have other income without having to return all the profit to the state in form of taxes. Due to the implosion of the pension system and a large number of older people living under the poverty, under the line of poverty, that's over 50% of older people in Croatia. The state needs to align the tax system by passing legislature which would enable the senior to do additional profit, and we have some researchers that shows that older people are willing to do such. The main here is that
we had I think the microphone cut at the very end. Marina, if you can repeat the very last sentence.
Sorry.
So you were talking about the difficulty of people to make some profit if they are also having a pension, right? And that this is an obstacle to older people's participation, right? Marina? Okay, so Marina seems to have a problem with the microphone. It's a pity because the example she was giving is really interesting. So I would say, Philip, we can leave it here, but we are still awaiting written contributions. So you still have some time to share with us any written feedbacks you may want on these two topics of social protection and education. We gave first deadline for the 25th of January, so Friday next week. So please try to respect that one, because then we will have only 4 days to actually deliver the final written contribution. So if you send us some inputs, for those of you who haven't done so, if you send us some input in the next week, that's still perfectly fine for us. Okay, so we can close, I think, the webinar here. I see that Neus was having some problems with the connection. I'm really sorry for that, Neus, but we will post this webinar online. As I was saying before, we will publish it in YouTube and share with you all participants, and maybe also with the wider Age membership, we will share the link. And also, let me recommend you to join also the webinar that we will be having on Tuesday, which will be focusing on long-term care and autonomy and independence. We'll be looking at those topics more into detail regarding, how you define those rights and what should be the state's obligation, because this is the kind of input they are asking for those two specific rights that we already discussed in an exploratory way in 2018. So we need to enter into such, let's say, detail, but trust me, discussions will be accessible and understandable for everyone. We will make an effort for this to be really the case. So so thanks to everyone. Philippe, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, just the reminder that the clock is ticking and we have to draw up our contributions in a very short time. So please be quick in providing your questionnaires. Especially on education, we have received only one contribution for now, so it would be really helpful to have more.
Yeah, absolutely. We will need some more to deliver a written contribution indeed. So thanks to everyone. Thanks for joining, and hope to see most of you, all of you, if possible, on Tuesday in the next webinar. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.